Guys, just wanted to see if you wanted to join me today for a talk about keto and cholesterol. Everybody and their mama always asks questions about what happens to their cholesterol when they go on a ketogenic diet. And so we're going to discuss that. I've got several experts that are on here today with me, a medical doctor, a PhD, and going to have a nice conversation all about keto and cholesterol. So if you have questions, we can definitely get those addressed here today on the show, but we're going to go live here on Clubhouse. We'll go ahead and start the room. Hello, everyone. Come on in. We are getting ready to start a Q&A session here all about keto and cholesterol. So if you have questions about ketosis and its impact on your cholesterol, we are here. Dr. John, what's up, my brother?
Jimmy, good to see you, man.
Hey, bud. So thanks for being here today.
I'm looking forward to it. Thank you for making me part of it.
Yeah. So we'll wait till some of the other moderators come and some more people habitate the room. But guys, we are live over on Jimmy on Clubhouse Instagram page. So if you ever miss any parts of the recordings that it says REC with the little red dot, that means we're recording it. So this will be available once this is over on IGTV. I'll also throw the past episodes up over on YouTube. You can definitely just type in Jimmy on Clubhouse as a keyword search and you'll find the past episodes there. If you missed it earlier, I did an update in the Fasting Clarity room all about my 18-day water and salt fast. So if you missed that earlier, go check it out. Jimmy on Clubhouse on Instagram or over on YouTube. You can check out how that went. But there's Dr. Nick. What's up, man?
Hey.
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 Welcome.
You were early.
Yeah, so I went live. You wanted me to go live over on Instagram. So I was talking to them and like, well, we'll just go live early and we'll pop in the doctors when they show up. So thank you guys both for being here. So guys, you're in the Keto Clarity Clubhouse. Welcome. Click on that green house at the top. You can subscribe to this channel. And this is a regular Friday show, 3 p.m. Eastern time, where we talk about the subject of keto and cholesterol. And guys, I wrote a book about this like 9 years ago. And people still have all these confusions about cholesterol as it relates to ketosis. And so I'm really glad that we have this Q&A session weekly to let people ask the questions that still gnaw at them.
Cool. I'm so glad Ada is here because last week, we talked for a fun over 100 minutes, but there was one question that came up that stumped, I think, both me and Dr. John.
Yes.
And it was about the antibacterial properties of LDL. So just dropping that in there because I might have just done some Googling as I was getting ready for this Clubhouse 30 minutes ago.
Yes.
We'll start off on a lighter topic.
I guess that's the fun part about this discussion is we're still learning so much about lipidology that even 10 years ago we didn't know about. And I think some of the subfractions of the particles and like what that means, like when it first came out, they're like, okay, this is nice, but we don't know what to do with this. So now we have a little more data that we kind of do know what to do with it.
Yeah, I'm inclined to just get people up here and start a Q&A.
Of course, yeah.
Places we can start. So
absolutely. So guys, if you want to pop up, definitely raise your hand. We'll get you up on stage. I know you have questions about cholesterol. That's why you came in this room today. So definitely raise your hand. We will pop you up here. You got a prestigious panel of people that know a thing or two about cholesterol. If I've done any one subject over the years, you guys, about keto, it's this whole question about cholesterol. When I wrote Cholesterol Clarity, way back in 2013 it came out, I did 600 interviews all about cholesterol. So I got some of the talking points down, you guys. So come on up, raise your hand. Otherwise, I'm going to pull some of you up. So don't make me do that. You have questions about cholesterol. Are you worried about your cholesterol? If not, why not? If you are, why? Let's have a conversation. That's what's fun about these panels here on Clubhouse. So we're gonna make you come up. I'm gonna start picking a few people. So if I pull you up, don't get mad. I just want to have some people
talk back and forth, Jimmy and Dr. John. Oh, there we go.
Yeah, so Shan, go right ahead. What's your question, darling?
Hey, me and my husband, we've been doing the keto probably, I don't know, about 8 weeks. Should we get our cholesterol checked and see what's going on? Or what do you all think about that?
My gut would be no, it's a little too early because you're probably still in the weight loss phase. And when you're still losing weight, it's a horrible time to try to check lipids in a snapshot in time because it's not really going to give you accurate readings. Do you guys concur?
I'd actually disagree. I don't know if you have a baseline panel, but cholesterol readings, they'll change within a few days. I mean, LDL, Dave Feldman's done some work on this. Within 3 days, they're going to be changing. Yes, you might still be in flux, but after 8 weeks, there will be a substantial change. And I think it's always good to just be responsible and follow these numbers. These numbers being more than just a standard lipid panel, and we can get into that. But even if you do just get a standard lipid panel, I think it's reassuring to look for higher HDL and lower triglycerides. Because sometimes, for whatever reason, in certain people, you have particular sensitivities, and even if you're, doing a ketogenic diet, your lipids might not be excellent. I don't think it's, just because you're eating low carb, your lipids are necessarily going to be excellent. We were talking last week, and somebody came up and was talking about their profile, and Dr. John and I both picked up on the fact that his triglycerides were still pretty high. Whereas on a low carb diet, your triglycerides should drop dramatically. And so I think it's good to have a sense. I wouldn't worry about LDL as an isolated metric. If you want, you can get subfractionations, and we can talk about that. But just looking for a higher HDL above like 50 milligrams per deciliter and a lower triglyceride, I'd say below 80 milligrams per deciliter, I think it's a responsible thing to do. Dr. John, what are your thoughts if you're there?
Yeah, obviously none of us are going to provide any medical advice. I'm not an MD, I'm a scientist. So, I think, you might want to have a conversation with your doctor. I always like to have a baseline to know kind of where I'm starting. And then after I do something for, let's say, 12 weeks, it's nice to go back and retest to fall and your HDL to go up. You might want to go back and look at your last set of blood work and see where those two are. For most people, they're going to, most Americans, just as a ballpark, they're going to have triglycerides around 150 and their HDL is going to be at 50. So they're going to be at 3 to 1. And I think most people, when they go on keto, that number starts coming down and it starts to, I like to keep mine around 1 to 1. So I'll leave it at that. But I think you have to make that decision, in conjunction with your doctor. It's nice to know where you're starting.
Dr. John, do you know that the average American HDL and triglycerides are 50 and 150? I would think those are like thresholds for maybe sort of healthy, but I wouldn't suspect most Americans have HDLs at 50. What do you think?
I guess I'm thinking about over the years and the different people and the blood work that I've looked at. I haven't gone out and said what are the averages. Generally they're going to flag it as high if it's above 150 in the U.S., and I think they're going to flag your HDL as low. I don't know if it's 45. I don't know.
It's 40.
It's 40.
40, okay.
Yeah, I think it's a lower.
But
the reference ranges are not optimal ranges. I think we can all agree on
That's
that.
right.
Yeah, I think that's a key thing, and that's one of the things that always concerns me is that the optimal range is very different from the lab range will change as people get unhealthier. So, if you look at the liver enzymes on your test, the ALT and the AST, 30 years ago, if you ran a test and you came in at a certain number, it would have been flagged as being high because people were metabolically more healthy. Now there's so many people in the test that are getting high numbers on their liver enzymes that the actual range has increased. So those are not set up as what's optimal. That's just where does 95% of the population fall? And in a population of unhealthy people, you don't want to be near the edge on those numbers. I'm Dr.
Exactly.
John. I'm going to hand back the mic.
Yeah,
That's a great point. And I just want to also say, when most people interpret the numbers, you need to take the numbers in context of other numbers. That's especially true with LDL, but even in the subfractionations, like a high LDL particle count or high ox LDL, it needs to be interpreted in the context of other numbers, which shed light on why that number might be high or low. And we can talk about each individual metric, but I just wanted to add that on. The reference ranges are not optimal, and all numbers only are meaningful in the context of other numbers.
And Dr. John, you made a good point about optimal ranges versus in range, because a lot of people will write to me and say, I'll ask how their blood numbers are doing, specifically like cholesterol numbers. Oh, they're all in the normal range. I'm like, no, that wasn't my question. Because in range, you could still be very metabolically unhealthy at 45 HDL and a 145 triglyceride. That's a sign you're teetering on something being out of whack, which is why when Dr. Nick said HDL over 50, and I usually say triglycerides under 100, but you're right, under 80 it starts to be more in that optimal level. I always tell people to try to aim for under 70 for your trigs, over 70 for your HDL as kind of that sweet spot of optimization.
Yeah, the easy number I use is trig to HDL ratio of 1 or less.
Yes.
That just you're number 1 if you have that ratio below that. So
the metaphor that I always use is I saw a video years ago where a car came tumbling off the road on Pikes Peak. I think the folks survived, but the thing is, if you're on the edge of that road on Pikes Peak, you may still be in the normal range. You still may be on the pavement, but if anything happens, you can go right off the edge and be tumbling down. So whether it's A1C or C-reactive protein, there's a lot of things where you can be normal, but you can be heading towards an iceberg that can take you out.
Yes.
So I think you have to you want to build up your health bank account so that if you end up traveling for 3 weeks and you're eating crappy food and you're not exercising, you're still in a good range. You don't want to be right at the edge of the road where anything can push you off that cliff.
That's right.
So that's how I looked at it.
Shan, did we answer your question?
I had a blood test probably a year ago for insurance purposes. I'm out working right now, so I don't have it in front of me. But they said I was getting close to having high cholesterol. I'm not severely overweight. I feel like I eat healthy.
Well, the question would be, having high cholesterol, are you worried about that in some way?
Yeah, I guess.
Why? 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 What do you think's going to happen?
Heart issues.
Okay, so this is the distinction I want people to have. High cholesterol is not the disease. Heart disease is the disease. So how do you get heart disease? Like Dr. John was just talking about, some of these other metrics. High CRP, that's something to pay attention to. If that bad boy is up definitely over 3, then you're starting to lean towards having an inflammatory state. Optimally, you want that 1.0 or less. So also getting like hard metrics of, do you have signs of heart disease? So this is where a CAC score, the whole CT heart scan that you can have run, and you can see if there's any signs of calcified plaque actually happening. So before you worry about a high cholesterol meaning something, these are the other things that I think are far more important. Do you guys concur?
Yeah, completely. I mean, total cholesterol is basically a meaningless metric. I mean, it's like saying, if I just say someone is 216 pounds, like, what health advice should you give them? Should they lose weight? Are they unhealthy? Well, guess what? Usain Bolt weighs 216 pounds.
Yes.
So, like, it doesn't give you any detail just to say high cholesterol. Maybe you have really high HDL. And
yes.
Your total cholesterol is high because of that. That's a meaningless statement.
I have an analogy for total cholesterol that I think puts this home, and I want to hear Dr. John's thoughts too. So Shan, knowing your total cholesterol is like knowing the end of a baseball game, the cumulative score was 30. You don't know if it was 29-1, a blowout, or if it was a 16-14 barn burner. You just don't know what that means. So total cholesterol includes one number you want higher, the HDL, one number that's estimated, not even directly measured, the LDL-C. So it's really an irrelevant marker. Dr. John?
Yeah, and one other thing to keep in mind is, I don't know if it was 10, 15, or 20 years ago, but It used to be that if your cholesterol was below, your total cholesterol was below 220, you were considered to have normal cholesterol. And I think they looked at that and said, if we brought that number down by 10% to 200, wow, we would have a lot of additional people that would have to be put on statins. Now, I know that's a little bit of a skeptical view, but there was a lot of pressure applied to bring that number down.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know really if a lot of lives were saved by that. I do know that, in an average year, and this was 5 or 6 years ago, they sold $25,000 million worth of statins. So 25 billion. And I don't know what the number is today.
29.
It's come up.
29 million.
29 billion. Yeah.
Right.
So so if there's a lot of dollars at stake here. I'm not anti-statin, and I think for some people, I think they're right. However, it concerns me when it's kind of like, if you don't take this pill, you're going to die. I like what Jimmy said. I think the calcium scan is a better indicator of the health of your arteries, and do you have problem areas? Because there are people that have very high cholesterol, but they have a 0 on their calcium scan. So I think if you're concerned, and I think that's a relatively inexpensive test, I don't know, maybe $100.
$150.
How much is it? I'm sorry.
$150.
$150. Okay, yeah. So that would be the test that I would want to look at, and then you can move from there. Total cholesterol, I don't think means a lot. LDL particle number, or ApoB100, there's something there, but I don't think total cholesterol means much of anything. I agree with Dr. Nick and with Jimmy. So thanks, Jimmy.
Yeah, I want to.
What was the name of that test that you said was 150?
It's a calcium scan.
CT heart scan.
Artery calcium scan.
You could ask
it looks actually at your arteries to see how much plaque there is developed. And I actually know some of my relatives with LDLs around 400 who are in their 50s and have CAC scores of 0.
So, Shan, make sure you've got to ask your doctor for a prescription. Make sure they get you the one that does not include the dye. The dye contrast is about $600 or $700, and that you don't need that much radiation, and you don't need the contrast. Get the one that's around $150, and it's about a 3-minute test in a CT machine, and you'll get your CAC score within a few days.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Shan.
And I just want to add one more distinction, because we were using the analogies of the Usain Bolt and the baseball game. If anybody who's listening to this, or physicians, probably could assume that the high cholesterol quote was high LDL, and in about 20 to 30% of people, LDL does go up on a ketogenic diet or a low carb diet. But again, you need to look at it a little more granularly, because what often happens is that the healthy form of LDL, not all LDL is bad, will go up. And then actually the unhealthy forms will go down, but the overall will be an increase. But then you're just summing it all up together and looking, the overall increased, even though the bad form actually went down.
Yes, so you're looking for pattern A, which I always call pattern awesome, and then pattern B, pattern bad, is the small dense LDL, which is pretty indicative when people have lower cholesterol, but they have more small dense LDL cholesterol. It's no bueno. So, guys, if you want to join us in the conversation, definitely raise your hand. We'll get you up here on stage. You can ask your questions all about keto and cholesterol. Looks like our bud Kendrick came up on stage, and then he disappeared just as soon as I introduced him. So, come on.
Works with me in the Metabolic Health Alliance.
CLUBHOUSE. So. Well, you're welcome to join us, Kendrick. You don't have to be.
Want to be a mod with me?
You don't have to be.
John, let me know.
You don't have to be shy, Kendrick. We'll bring you up here on the stage. So if you want to ask us a question about keto and cholesterol, definitely raise your hand. We'll get you up here on stage. Ada, you're up next. What you got for us?
Yes, hi, guys. Hope everyone is doing okay. This lovely Friday.
Yes.
I just want to troubleshoot a situation with one of my clients, see what you guys think. I think I brought this up at a different forum with different mods. So, but this is new to you guys, so you haven't heard it, hopefully. So, apologize if you have. But I have a client. He was doing keto for 4 months with me. His previous HDL was like bottom floor 30s, high tries. Actually, normal tries, and normal LDL. So 3 months after, no, 4
What are
months
high?
after.
What are normal and normal? What is normal tries? What is normal?
Well. Of course, we like it in the low carb community. We like it in the 40s, of course. But for him, not being low carb, it was like, I want to say 140. So, but the guy has severe adiposity, abdominal, central adiposity, high blood pressure. Glucose in the 160s, 130s, 160s. Insulin was 12. But then the thing is that 4 months after the program, he retested, and his HDL did not move. It was still in the 30s. I was very surprised with that. His triglycerides actually went up to 253. And his blood pressure didn't start going down till after like week 12 in the program, up week 10 in the program, which I also found a little bit unusual. So I had him retest 2 months later, and HDL is still low in the 30s. Tries went down, but not significantly. It was still high, 191, and then LDL went down also, but to 143. Question.
Did you retest his fasting insulin?
Yeah, well, I was
Either
going to
the
ask the
second
same
too.
thing. What's insulin?
Well, it was 12 to begin with at the beginning of the program. So, and I did not retest, no.
I think,
But being 12, I mean, I know it's still higher than what we like, but it's not like astronomically high. And the thing is, my thing is, he is so compliant. He has been one of the most compliant people I've ever worked with. So I can really put my hands on fire for him that he was doing everything that's instructed. So, I just want to get your thoughts on that.
Is he actively losing weight?
And that's another thing. His weight loss was not dramatic. No, and he has a lot of weight to lose. He was like 160, 70 pounds, and like I said, severe central adiposity. So I'm assuming
what are
that
his BHB levels run? And does he have like a food diary?
Yes. So that's all part of the program. But I'm on vacation. I'm out of town, and I don't have his file in front of me, and I cannot remember from the top of my head. But if I remember correctly, he was getting into ketosis like in the ones.
Yeah, I mean, it would be interesting to know what his food diary looked like, the composition of various, fats, saturated versus mono versus poly. And also, you can do genetic screens. There are genetic contraindications for ketogenic diets. I haven't memorized the entire list. There, are tables of papers. I think if you look at, one place to look is Kossoff 2009. They did a white paper on epilepsy. And I remember there being a table, maybe it was table 2 or 3, where they list some of the, the genes you could screen for, which would be contraindications for a ketogenic diet, like if you're just not processing fat.
Are those expensive for the average person to run? Do you need a doctor's? Oh, I'm assuming you do need a doctor's prescription, of course, but can the average person get them?
Yeah,
easily?
I think that these genetic screens aren't generally that expensive for the specified genes. I don't know what the exact value, what labs order, but it might be worth ordering. And then another thing to just consider is whether it's a quirk of his diet and lifestyle, whether it's an identifiable genetic contraindication. Like if it's not working for him for whatever reason, be it social or biological, then it's not working for him.
So
I think ketogenic and low carb diets are a very potent tool, and I think it's great trying to troubleshoot. But there are other options. He could do like a slow carb diet with intermittent fasting, see how that works.
Well, and
that's another thing. I was pushing the fasting because his HOMA IR was 3. So at the end of the program, I was really pushing for that, and wasn't moving the needle that much. So that's a very interesting point. Just to piece his mind, of course, I recommended the CAC test. And of course the particle test, just to be more detailed. He hasn't done it just to rule anything out, but he is high risk for cardiovascular disease if you
So-
look at his other markers.
So
What's his family history? I mean, family history is important, and
Yes.
visceral adiposity.
Yes, I pretty much treated his entire family, and they are all are hypertensive. Some are diabetics, but central adiposity actually it was very isolated to him. His mom has fatty liver and cardiovascular disease.
What's his ethnicity?
He's Spanish, like Dominican.
And do you know if he's using a lot of polyunsaturated fat in his diet?
No, like I said, that's the first thing I review with everybody, fats and healthy fats. And like I said, he was anally compliant, tracking everything, to the point of, hey, chill, So, yes.
Did you measure a CRP, a high sensitivity C-reactive protein?
Yes. I don't remember. I was looking, like I said, I'm not home to look at his file, and I don't remember from the top of my head. This was like 3-4 months ago.
So,
I think that's part.
so Ada.
Also, I'm wondering if something was. No, excuse me, Jim.
Go ahead, John.
Yeah, I'm also wondering if there's something missing biochemically. So I wonder if there's some issue with some micronutrient or something like that that's blocking a pathway, so things aren't working right. So I'd be interested in looking across, if he's not getting enough L-carnitine and he's not transporting, fatty acids, if he's somehow deficient in copper and certain enzymes aren't working, or he's not getting enough magnesium. I'd be interested to look across all those things and see if maybe there's something going on in terms of a micronutrient. Dr. Nick, Jimmy, I don't know what you guys think.
I'd love to see, some de-identified data more specifically, because without the specifications on what he's eating, the family history, it's hard to make precise speculations, because that is a little bit curious if indeed he is eating a clean ketogenic diet and assuming he doesn't have any outright genetic contraindications, discovered or undiscovered. So I would be interested in seeing if I could propose any troubleshooting mechanisms, but find me on Twitter, and if he's consenting to have his data de-identified, I'd love to give a second opinion.
And Ada, I would say from a practical. I'm sorry, I was talking. I didn't hear you, Ada.
No, I was saying to Dr. Nick that would be fantastic, because again, this is a little bit on the unusual side for what I'm used to seeing in terms of results and stuff. So it would be so nice, especially for someone that's being so compliant. So that would be fantastic. Thank you for that. Yes, Jimmy.
So the only other thing I would add from a practical standpoint, just from my own experience, that kind of gets the needle moving. I mean, if he's doing keto well, he's well nourished, he feels good doing it, he's super compliant, which is what you said, he should be able to handle maybe a few days of fasting. And I know that can have a dramatic effect. I know my lipoprotein a, just on a 5-day fast, dropped from 423 to under 100. Like, that's dramatic changes in some of these advanced lipids. And so I wonder if that could be something that could kickstart it for him. It'd be something worth trying if you could broach the subject of fasting.
Yeah, he's no longer part of my program, but every time I see an article that I find of interest that fits his description, I always, shoot it his way. So I can reach out to him and see.
Yes.
But thank you, guys. That was just so unusual. I always like to bring his example up to see.
Thank you, Ada. Yes. We really appreciate it.
And also, Dr. John, you owe me an answer. My bacteria question.
That's okay. That's on me. So I won't go down the rabbit hole with all the mechanisms, but here are a couple. So LDL helps the LDL receptor on the liver take up lipopolysaccharide from gram-negative bacteria and LTA from gram-positive bacteria. So they're actually exploring things like, although this decreases LDL, PCSK9 receptors, because they increase LDL receptors on the liver. It still requires LDL, but it actually is being explored for sepsis patients. But even more interesting, I found this one paper, I think a more recent paper, about quorum sensing. So for those that don't know, quorum sensing is a property whereby organisms, they send off little chemicals, And as the community builds, so say you have a community of bacteria, as that community builds, there's an increasing concentration of this, whatever, bacterial pheromone, you could call it. And once it hits a threshold, everybody in the colony knows, oh, there are a lot of us. So maybe they think like, oh, the army is big enough, now we can attack. So that happens with Staph aureus. Staph aureus actually lives in the body, but when it can reach a certain threshold, it might attack and become infectious. And so one thing that LDL does is that it binds up, the ApoB protein binds up the quorum-sensing pheromone from these bacteria. So it's analogous to if you were able to intercept all the messages going among your opponent's army. I thought that was the coolest mechanism. There were a bunch, but I thought that one was pretty cool, so I wanted to share that one.
And just to build on what Dr. Nick said, when we talk about LPS, so if you have bacteria in your body, gram-negative bacteria, your immune system comes in and blasts it and breaks up its membranes. And so one of the things that's released are these things called lipopolysaccharides, or LPS. And they really piss off your immune system. And anywhere they go, you're going to jack up your inflammation massively. So if you think of LDL, and like Dr. Nick said, there's a binding protein that LDL carries that mops up and takes that up, so now it's not causing other immune cells to go on the attack and bring your inflammation through the roof. So I was just trying to give you a simpler way to look at that. So, and then obviously there are other things that are produced that operate on that same mechanism. So when your immune system destroys things, those fragments can really wreak havoc by triggering other immune cells to release more cytokines and to tell everyone to go on the attack. I'm Dr. John. I'm finished speaking.
Oh, that was so, I love that visual, Dr. John. Thank you.
Ada, thank you for coming up on stage. Lindsay, you're up next.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo Dr. John. I really appreciate that. The first thing that came to my mind was what's running interference? If we're not seeing the numbers move, then that means that there's some sort of interference, and just getting to the root cause of what that is and removing that interference, and then the body has that amazing ability to heal. And I appreciate your thoughts, Jimmy, about fasting, because that's a great way to reduce inflammation in the body so that it can tap into its innate intelligence to really go and do what it knows best, the physician inside each one of us. So thank you.
Thank you. Any comments, Dr. Nick or John?
I'm thinking, Jimmy, that the fasting may turn on.
The fasting may turn on what?
Jimmy, I think the fasting may turn on certain genes, and that may be one of the mechanisms where it kind of jump starts things. So I always think of your genes like all the apps on your iPhone, but if they don't run, if you don't actually run the app, then you don't make the protein and nothing happens. And sometimes apps are buried. The epigenetic side says, do we run them or not? Sometimes they're buried 9 screens down. And even though you have the code to do something, you're not doing it and you're not making the protein. And I think fasting turns on some of these genes, and so the proteins are expressed. I'd like to hear Dr. Nick's take. I know that's an oversimplification, but I always tell people your DNA is all the apps that you have on your iPhone. But what 80% of what matters, though, is do you run them or not? Not do you have the code, but are you running bad code? And if you are, it's going to cause you problems. Or if you have good code, but you're not running it, then you're missing out on that opportunity. But I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Nick.
Yeah, epigenetics is what governs the body. I agree with you, Dr. John. I mean, your finger cell, your thumbnail cell, and your neurons, they have the exact same DNA. They're the same genes, it's just which ones get turned on and off. So epigenetics is the key to who we are in every way. And the astonishing thing about ketosis is that ketone bodies, yeah, they're a great fuel. Maybe they're the 4th macronutrient in addition to proteins, fats, and carbs. But I think the more amazing quality is that they're potent signaling molecules. Beta hydroxybutyrate, it binds to receptors on cell surfaces, but it's also an amazing epigenetic modifier. So it works in a few ways. One way is it inhibits these things called histone deacetylases, which are themselves epigenetic modifiers. So it regulates the modifier, and then in that way can turn on lots of genes. And then there was a new paper in Science Advances a few weeks ago, I think it was in February, and what it showed is that beta-hydroxybutyrate itself, the ketone body itself, is what's called post-translational modification. So it sticks to proteins, including the proteins around which our DNA is wrapped, and in that way can change metabolism and change gene expression, change epigenetics. I think they identified 1,397 different proteins to which BHB binds as an epigenetic or as a post-translational modifier and having epigenetic effects. So I agree with you, Dr. John, and I love that iPhone with the apps analogy. The only thing I would say is that we just don't know how yet. We know that it does, we don't know how. And so what you can do is pathway enrichment analyses, kind of see what general functions are being modulated. And what comes up again and again is that ketosis, which would be induced by fasting, Jimmy, as you know, modifies immune function. So we know it modifies immune function. Exactly how it does it at the epigenetic level, we don't know. But some studies suggest that it's generally anti-inflammatory, but it can also prime the immune system to be very responsive when there is a challenge, which is exactly what you want. You want an army that responds, an immune system army that responds when it needs to, and then is quiet otherwise. So my doses is very good for proper immunoregulation. But we don't know exactly how it does so at the epigenetic level.
Yeah. Lindsay, did you have all your questions answered?
Oh, sure. I think those are all really great comments. And the epigenetic expression is paramount. Like you said, I love that analogy with the apps, turning them on and off and whether they're running. That's fantastic. So I guess the question, I do have one question.
Sure.
So if somebody were to look at their labs, how would they know whether they're on the right track or off track? You know, I think, Jimmy, you had told me about some calculation. That's what I was kind of wanting you to go over.
Yeah, the triglyceride to HDL ratio. And a lot of times in the mainstream, they're still stuck on, what is it, total to HDL ratio, you guys? Isn't that kind of what one of the standard panels that they do that ratio? That's kind of an archaic way compared to triglyceride to HDL, right, Dr. Nick?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say if you're going to get a basic lipid panel, triglyceride to HDL ratio is what I look at because it's going to inform the quality of the LDL.
Yes.
So that's kind of the red flag. The LDL higher is what people are going to base statin treatment on. But if your triglyceride to HDL ratio is low, then it indicates that you have pattern A type HDL.
Yes.
LDL, which is what you want. So that's why I think the triglyceride to HDL ratio is really good. And if you want to know the exact numbers about what is the threshold for a good triglyceride to HDL ratio beyond the simple one that I gave, Paul Mason gives a good lecture on interpreting lipid panels. And I remember at the end of that lecture, there are some graphs that he pulls up showing exactly how the probability of being pattern A or pattern B tracks with the triglyceride to HDL ratio. So you can look up a YouTube lecture by Paul Mason on interpreting lipid panels and kind of scroll to the end and it'll pop out at you. Paul
is brilliant. I love that particular video. And yeah, it's a proxy marker. It's kind of a poor man's version of the NMR lipo profile. If you have a triglyceride to HDL ratio under 1, as Dr. Nick was noting earlier, and as Dr. John was noting, ApoB is a proxy marker for that LDLP. Again, we don't know whether the particle number actually means anything. I think we all agree on this panel. It's the propensity of the small, dense LDL, trying to keep it as low as possible that you're aiming for.
Yeah, and just because there's so much nomenclature, and I know it gives you guys all a giant headache, pattern A, when Dr. Nick talks about that picture just a big fluffy beach ball. So you have a large fluffy LDL particle, and then pattern B is like a baseball. It's very small. It's the small dense stuff that seems to be more damaging, that's more readily oxidized, that causes more problems in that first layer in your blood vessels. So Are you okay with that, Dr. Nick? I'm trying to just give people
Yeah.
a mental picture.
Even a BB.
You know, yeah, so a BB, yeah, exactly. So
Yeah, I mean, the pattern B does include lots of different types. So I like that analogy, but when you actually look at the spectra, it's the pattern A looks like a big smooth curve, and then the pattern B has lots of spikes. The actual spike tends to still be with a big LDL, but it's just multimodal. But I do love the analogies. One I like to use to kind of explain how LDL is not the bad guy, and this is bringing it down to earth. I realize I like to go into the nomenclature a little bit, but I think about Star Wars and Anakin Skywalker. Where like Anakin's a good.
Sorry, keep going.
All right, yeah. I can't speak over those, but like he's not a bad guy. He's a good guy. He's actually a Jedi Knight or a Jedi Padawan. I don't know Star Wars that well, but he's only bad when he's corrupted by the dark side, by the dark force, and then he becomes Darth Vader, and then he's a bad guy. So you can imagine Anakin as like big fluffy beach ball LDL, like Dr. John was saying, pattern A, and then he can get corrupted and turn into small, dense LDL, baseball LDL, or in my analogy, Darth Vader. And then the question is, well, what's the corrupting force? What's the dark side? And the dark side, the corrupting force, is basically sugar. So what happens to turn Anakin or beach ball into Darth Vader or baseball is that the LDL is floating around in your blood. And what's supposed to happen is that after it drops off its fat cargo, the triglycerides in your muscles for fuel, it's supposed to go back to the liver and just get taken up. So if there's a lot of sugar around in your blood, then what happens is the sugar attaches to the LDL molecule, a protein called ApoB, which we've mentioned a couple times, and that blocks LDL being taken back up into the liver. You can even think about ApoB as like the passport, and so it just like gets rid of the passport, and then where does the LDL go? It has nowhere to go. So it gets stuck in the bloodstream. And over time, then it gets oxidized. Things like seed oils can exacerbate that process. And it becomes small dense. And then it becomes the little baseball, it becomes the Darth Vader. And because sugar also damages the blood vessel wall, it actually opens up an avenue for that small dense Darth Vader LDL to slip into your artery walls and start to contribute to cardiovascular disease. So there's another analogy. I hope that made sense.
And let me add one more wrinkle to that. The vegetable oils that you noted, very high in omega-6 fats, very inflammatory. They lower your LDL-C, Lindsay. So when you go to your doctor and you should probably try to cook in healthier oils like canola oil, and you do, you will see the LDL go down, but it's at the sacrifice of these large fluffy kind that are protective, and then what's left behind not only gets left behind as a preponderance of small dense LDL, but it oxidizes those. So it makes you even more susceptible to heart disease, even though your LDL-C goes down on your cholesterol panel.
Yeah, that's a good point, Jim. And those polyunsaturated fats they rust the easiest, meaning oxygen can rip electrons off of those, or other things can rip electrons off of those the easiest, because they have multiple double bonds, and oftentimes those double bonds are conjugated, meaning every other carbon, and that makes it easier to attack them. Olive oil, which is monounsaturated, is more stable than these polyunsaturated fats, and then the saturated fats with no double bonds are the most stable, because there's really not a good place for oxygen to attack. You don't have electrons that can readily be ripped away by oxygen. So just wanted to share that piece as well.
I think the exceptions in the fruit vegetable oil family, I would say, are olive oil, and then macadamia nut and hazelnut oil both have as much or more monounsaturated fat than olive oil. So hazelnut and macadamia nut are useful, of course, avocado oil. And then this one's going to be controversial. I want to see what Dr. John's reaction is. Sesame oil. Dr. John, what are your thoughts on sesame oil?
Sesame oil, I think, is unique because, and I think it may have some health benefits. I know it's been used a lot in the Far East for thousands of years. One thing, it does contain something called sesame, although I don't know if the oil contains it, but the sesame seeds do. And that sesame actually changes your production of different eicosanoids. So there's a point where it can go down a good pathway or a bad pathway. The bad pathway makes arachidonic acid, and the good pathway makes prostaglandin E1. And sesame actually shifts that balance more towards the good pathway. I think it also has a relatively high smoke point, Dr. Nick, so it doesn't burn as easily. I normally cook with avocado oil because it has a high smoke point, and I have used some sesame oil, but I don't use it. I haven't really looked into it enough to know if it's superior, but I do know that the sesame seeds have that very unique molecule that's beneficial.
Yeah, can I go on about that? Because I've been really interested in sesame recently.
Yeah.
Because I am also, like, I think both of you, Jimmy and Dr. John, generally anti-seed oil. But for the reason you said, Dr. John, that sesame, it is present in the oil, and I think it actually needs to be in conjunction with enough omega-3s, at least ALA or EPA, so from like fatty fish or even flaxseed, to block that delta-5 desaturase enzyme that you alluded to. So that's the one that produces the inflammatory prostaglandins. So that's interesting, but it has a lot of other interesting properties too. So I found one paper showing that sesame and then actually something called sesmolin and sesamol, it's kind of cousins, block linoleic acid, block omega-6 oxidation. So when you throw those, they're called lignans, when you throw those 3 lignans in with linoleic acid, it just doesn't oxidize. It protects it, which is really interesting. And then another thing is that sesame in the liver increases alcohol processing and beta oxidation, fat burning genes. That was one of the things that really drew me to it. So I've been recently doing a little sesame oil experiment on myself over the past month or so, and I noticed when I have about a tablespoon and a half of toasted sesame oil, I actually use Spectrum brand, I just get it at Whole Foods, my morning ketones are so much higher than normal. So normally without the sesame oil, I'd be at like 1.3, 1.6 in that range. And I've been taking a tablespoon and a half of toasted sesame oil just with dinner. And this morning, like, my GKI was 1 and my ketones were 3.3, which is pretty interesting. I don't know if, I know you're like a biohacker like me, Dr. John. I would be interested to see if you could replicate that. But my ketones have been a lot higher. And my HSCRP, I got to retest it. It's below 1. And my HDL has gone up. It's 116. My LDL actually did drop by 173 points. And my triglycerides dropped a tiny bit. They're at 40. So right now I have interesting profile. I'm just really interested in sesame now.
So, Dr. Nick, you've inspired me to go buy some toasted sesame oil and to start experimenting with it. So I'll report back in a month or two and tell you how it's worked for me as well. Very cool.
We're all going to go buy some sesame oil. Thanks, Dr. Nick.
I'd love to go to the next question.
Yes, we are.
At some point, I'd love to talk about why does your body make cholesterol? What do we use it for? What are the good things? Because all you ever hear about is how cholesterol is designed to kill you. And I know people that are so afraid of cholesterol, they won't eat an egg yolk. They'll eat egg whites.
Oh.
And I think to them, that's not a good move.
Oh.
And so at some point, as we have time, I'd love us to talk about why does your body make cholesterol? What does it do to your membranes? What do you use it for in terms of making vitamin D, making estrogen, making testosterone, things like that, because you don't hear that nearly enough, because without cholesterol, we all die. And that, without that, it's as fundamental to life as water. And I wish it didn't get smeared so badly so often. Yes.
And what's amazing about it is people think if they don't eat cholesterol that they can keep their cholesterol levels in their body low. Endogenous production will kick up if you're not feeding yourself cholesterol, and it will downregulate if you feed yourself cholesterol. I remember Steve Finney told a story about how he wanted to test this whole eating eggs will raise your cholesterol nonsense. And so he ate 19 eggs in one sitting. and he tests his cholesterol before and then a obligate amount of time after doing that. You want to know how high his cholesterol went up? 1 point. Because the internal...
The liver says, I don't need to build it.
Exactly.
We're getting plenty in the diet.
Exactly.
Put less in the diet, the liver says, oh, we have to crank up cholesterol synthesis. No, I absolutely agree with you. I will say one thing on the eggs. Cook your eggs gently. You don't want to oxidize the cholesterol when it's in the yolk. So if you're cooking an egg, cook it at the lowest temperature. If you're going to flip it and make it over easy, you want the yolk to be still liquid. You might want to, congeal all the whites, but don't overcook your eggs because lower temperature and more gently, you don't want to oxidize the cholesterol before you eat it, because now you've turn it in from something that's useful to something that the body now has to deal with and get rid of.
So get used to over easy, people. So, Nick, I think we need to go to another questioner because we've got a bunch on stage. Lindsay, thank you for your question. Dr. Katrina, you're up next. What you got for us? Did we wait too long? Katrina, are you there? Kat, are you there? Hello, hello. All right, we'll go to Joan since Katrina seems to be gone. Joan, what you got for us?
Hello.
Hello.
Well, all three of you, I follow all of you. I'm a complete fan, and you are the trifecta of brains on all of this. I am loving every single word.
Thank you.
I'm taking copious notes. All right. So my dad is on a statin, which is not surprising. And last night, Dr. Gundry was on here, and he was talking about that somebody should absolutely, if they have to be on it, which is really rare that people actually have to be on it, but he said that you should take CoQ10 with it.
Yes.
So I'm wondering if there's a dosage that you do, like that I could get him some CoQ10 and try to help him out with this, and what would the dose be? And I still have one other question, but this is the first one.
How much the statin is he taking? The max, 80 milligrams?
Gosh.
Because that matters.
I believe it's pretty high.
Yeah, the max is 80 milligrams unless it's severe. Dr. Nick, isn't that right? 80 milligrams kind of the highest they go with a statin?
It depends which one, I think.
Dr.
John?
Like Lipitor.
Yeah, I think on the Lipitor, the 80 milligrams is the highest dose. And, the thing I wanted to build on what Jimmy said, and that is that I've seen studies where you put somebody on 80 milligrams of Lipitor for 30 days, and you go back and measure their blood levels of CoQ10, and it cuts it in half. And CoQ10 is critical to your mitochondria. You can't create ATP without CoQ10. You're using it to pump protons across the membrane. I think, getting back to your question, I think most people would take somewhere between 100 and 200 milligrams of CoQ10. And you have a choice when you take it. You can take CoQ10, or you can take something called ubiquinol, which is the reduced form of CoQ10. And both work, but the ubiquinol apparently is absorbed better. And secondly, your body doesn't have to do the work to convert it from the oxidized form to the reduced form. So I would think something maybe 100 to 200 milligrams of ubiquinol might make sense. But again, he should have that conversation with his doctor. I take 100 milligrams of ubiquinol. I'm 61 just because I want to be here. I want to have 40 or 50 more good years. And generally your levels, if you look from age 30 to 40 to 50 to 60, your tissue levels go down. And I would like to maintain mine at the level of a healthy 30-year-old. So I take a little bit. There's no one magic bullet out there, but if you fix a lot of these things, I think you can accelerate repair, and you can prevent damage. And I think those are both really useful things to do.
And isn't it interesting that CoQ10 is a key heart health element? And yet the very thing you're supposed to take as a drug to help prevent a heart disease and a heart attack is stripping your body of a key heart health element. Think about that.
So, Jimmy, one interesting thing on CoQ10 I want to then let Dr. Nick jump in is about, I want to say 35 or 40 years ago, CoQ10 cost $10,000 a gram.
Whoa.
Because there was nowhere to make it. So you had to take 5,000 cattle hearts and blast them and then go through this incredibly complex isolation process to make it. So CoQ10 cost massively more than gold or platinum, or it was the price of diamonds, let's say. And it was the Japanese that figured out a biotechnology process to make it at scale. And for years, that was widely prescribed in Japan by doctors for heart health. And it very slowly took root here. I remember 25 years ago telling my doctor, by the way, that statins inhibit this enzyme, HMG-CoA reductase. And he was like, yeah, I know that. And I said, do you know what else your body uses that enzyme for? And he had a pause, and I said, it uses it to chain lengthen coenzymes Q2, 4, 6, and 8 into coenzyme Q10. And if you block that enzyme, your CoQ10 levels are going to drop. And he looked at me and he was like, John, how come I've never heard about this? And I said, Merck has a patent where they put 500 milligrams of CoQ10 into the pill with their statin just to prevent it. And I said, but they don't teach this to the drug reps. They don't provide slides to the drug reps about this. But every biochemist, at Pfizer and every other pharmaceutical company knows, of course, they're going to lower CoQ10 levels. So I think it's a great idea. I don't think it's the only thing you should do. The other thing I'd say is I believe statins are more effective for people that have a higher C-reactive protein, because I think they work not necessarily or not completely by lowering cholesterol synthesis. I think they also work by reducing inflammation in the body. And I've seen data that says people with a high CRP get a bigger benefit. What's interesting is when they use other drugs that also provide the same cholesterol lowering, they don't see the same benefit. And I think it's because statins may be working more via an anti-inflammatory mechanism and also by triggering the liver to increase receptors on its surface. So you're picking up the cholesterol, it's pulling it out of your bloodstream and not letting it go round and around and oxidize. I'm going to bring Dr. Nick in. I'm sure he probably wanted to jump in 7 times there. So,
thanks. Yeah, I agree with all of that, but a couple other things I just do want to add, because we're pretty fixated on CoQ10. Other things that are affected by statins, especially like Lipitor, is vitamin D and K2. So those are other supplements that I think a lot of people should just be on D and K2, D3 and K2 in general. But like I take 4,000 IU of D3 and then 180 micrograms of K2 MK7. And also, if you need to be on a lipid, or one needs to be on a lipid lowering medication, there are a lot more options available than just like Lipitor. So even just the other statins like rovastatin or pravastatin, have the benefits of being less able to get into the brain. And as a neuroscientist, that's one area where I'm very conservative. You really don't want something going into the brain that's going to inhibit CoQ10 production, block complex 4 of the respiratory chain, which is, already blocked in Alzheimer's disease. So, if you're going to have negative side effects in the rest of the body, at least try to minimize those in the brain. And so there are some hydrophilic or water-liking statins that won't get into the brain as easily. And then there are other medications, like Zetia, which blocks cholesterol absorption in the gut, and that forces your liver to upregulate LDL receptors, or a PCSK9 inhibitor. For a lot of people, the expense might be prohibitive if insurance won't cover it, but I just wanted to throw out there the D3 and the K2, and that there are other options among statins that get to the brain less, or just other drugs entirely.
Thank you, guys. We're going to go back to Katrina. Are you back, Katrina? Going once, going twice. Kendrick, what you got for us?
I just Thanks for having me. I just wanted to add one thing about the statins. If you look at some of the data, I think it's very patient specific on who can benefit and who cannot benefit from a statin. That probably goes for any drug. But if you look at the people who benefit the most from statins are people also who have the lipid triad, who also have high triglycerides, low HDL, and high LDL. So looking at each patient specifically, I think you need to take all those factors into consideration, and in addition to their CoQ10, in addition to the CRP benefits, and so I think it's a very messy soup of risk factors that you have to consider on a patient by patient basis, and really not lump everybody into one basket.
Yeah, I agree. I'm actually going to make a strong claim on that point, because it's a really good point. I am not aware, I don't think there exists a study that any lipid-lowering medication, statin or otherwise, has shown benefits on outcome if somebody has low triglycerides and high HDL. I think if you have high HDL and low triglycerides, then lipid-lowering medications have never been shown to have any benefit.
And low CRP.
Yeah, I don't even think that needs to be included. I don't think they've ever shown benefit in people with low triglycerides and high HDL. I think Dave Feldman has a bounty out for that paper. If anybody can find that paper, he supposedly will give him money.
There's also a great slide that I've seen if you follow Dr. Brett Scher, he always puts it in all of his presentations. It's from the Framingham study. And basically what it shows is as LDL goes up, the risk of heart disease doesn't go up unless you also have high triglycerides and low HDL.
Yes.
And so thinking about statins, if you have a high LDL, but your triglyceride HDL ratio is pretty darn good, and let's say you do have a CRP that's really good, and also if you look at calcium score, if it's 0, statins have no benefit in patients with a calcium score of 0. So I think if you're thinking about, do I want to be on a statin or do I want to put somebody on a statin, if you have all that information, or if you're able to get all that information, then I think that would really help guide you and make it as patient-specific as possible.
Yeah, Kendrick, I think you make a great point, and I believe that every person has biochemical individuality. They have certain apps in their DNA and their hard drive. There are certain apps that they're running, but everyone's different, and people. Sometimes I don't like to see people give advice necessarily in general, because what's right for one person may not work for someone else. I think it's really critical to look at each person as an individual. But I think we're trying to provide a framework saying, okay, this is what you're hearing. Here's some research that maybe you haven't heard about, but I do think you're right. It's all about the individual and looking at their particular, biomarker fingerprint, and then seeing if it works or not. Because if you try something that should work on paper, it may not work for them. And in that case, you have to say, okay, what can we learn from this? And then what's our next approach? Because if it's not working, it's not working. So, I'm Dr. John. I'm finished speaking.
Thank you, John. So guys, I wanted to mention one more thing about total cholesterol, because I believe it was you, Dr. John, earlier alluded to how normal used to be 220 circa 10, 15 years ago. 25, 30 years ago, it was closer to like 260, 270. So it became progressively lower as a means of marketing a drug that a lot of people needed to go on that didn't really need to go on. So I want to talk about that total cholesterol marker, because when you look at these markers, it's a percentile. So generally the percentile is somewhere around 70 or 80% is the threshold, meaning if you hit this number or higher, you're at a higher risk for having whatever that condition is, or if you're below that marker, then you have a less risk. And with cholesterol, it's not 70 or 80%, it's the 50th percentile. So they have artificially made this 200 number that everybody just freaks out about. Oh, 201, I'm at great risk for heart disease. And that's never made any sense, especially in light of traditional cultures free from heart disease. They ate lots of saturated fats. They had all the everything. They were pretty healthy people. And their normal cholesterol, especially women in their, say, 60s, 70s, 80s, was 300. And so we freak out, doctors freak out when they see a 300 and they put these poor ladies who at that time in their life need that cholesterol then more than ever before, and they artificially lower it, putting them more at risk for all kinds of things, including Alzheimer's disease. So this is something to keep in mind, you guys. When you see that 200, that's a 50th percentile number. Every other health marker that you ever run is generally much higher than that.
That's a good point, Jimmy. I wonder if now's a good time to maybe for Dr. Nick and for you and I to talk a little bit about why the brain has the ability to make cholesterol, why virtually every cell in your body has that ability, and what is it used for, if that makes sense to you guys. I mean, I'll start out with, you can't make testosterone without cholesterol. That's the starting material.
Right.
You can't make estrogen, and you can't make vitamin D, but you can't make cell membranes either. I've seen it be so vilified over the last 30 years. Even I go back to when I first finished up my doctorate back in '85, and I remember I got my first cholesterol test as I was probably 26 at the time, and I was a little concerned because I had been so, I won't say brainwashed, but I had only heard one side of the equation for so long. So I remember I got my first test, and I think it came in around 190 for my total cholesterol. But even if you're a scientist, and even if you're in this field, you're still hammered with only one side of the picture, and that always concerns me. Now I have a much clearer view because I see both sides of it. I don't think cholesterol is meaningless. However, I do think that there are a lot of people taking statins where maybe there are other things that they could be doing and other markers that they could be trying to fix versus, like you said, total cholesterol, above 200.
Yeah, I think that's a great topic with Dr. John. So you mentioned vitamin D3, we mentioned CoQ10, and there's also just the digestion of fat. The bile cells, they're made from cholesterol, in addition to estrogen and testosterone. But my main area of interest being the brain. The brain, it's 2% of the body mass. It contains 25% of the body's cholesterol. Now, it can make its own. So if you have low cholesterol in the blood, it doesn't mean your brain's necessarily cholesterol deprived, but cholesterol is required by the brain. So to me, it's not very sensible to put drugs into the body that would inhibit the brain's ability to make cholesterol and deliver it around cells. So, for diseases like Alzheimer's or, cognitive decline in general, they might be in part due to a cholesterol deficit. So I can give you some examples or tidbits. The aging brain, it decreases its synthesis of cholesterol. It becomes worse at making cholesterol, which is needed for neurons to communicate with each other because there's a lot of cholesterol at the synapses, the endpoints of neurons. Also, high-risk genes for diseases like Alzheimer's, so ApoE4, it decreases the ability of these support cells, called astrocytes, to deliver cholesterol to neurons that need it. In addition to everything that's happening around your body, like outside your brain, cholesterol is absolutely required for proper brain function. Your brain usually can make enough on its own. Go ahead.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but my recollection is that people that have lower cholesterol generally don't do as well cognitively. So once you get through your 60s, that at that point, higher cholesterol leads to more longevity.
Yes.
And leads to less in terms of neurological conditions. So it's not, again, I hate to see it be considered an evil molecule when in fact that's not what the data says. But Nick, I don't know if you want to comment on that, and Jimmy as well.
Yeah, I mean, not only is there, yes, that's true, and I think it's especially strong in women, but the lifestyle choice or option that we're talking about here, ketogenic diets, they do a lot of other things too to protect against cognitive decline with respect to cholesterol, metabolism, and just fat metabolism in the brain. So, that ketone molecule that can be used to, it actually diverges from the same pathway as cholesterol, can be used to help support myelin sheaths, which help your nerves communicate with one another. I won't go down the rabbit hole with that, but I agree that that's true, and that there's so much more to the story there.
And I just want to build on one other thing that Dr. Nick said earlier. The brain, there's something called the blood-brain barrier. and it's there to protect the brain, and certain things cannot go through it. And that's why he's talking about certain statins are lipophilic, meaning they can dissolve into the lipid bilayers, and others are hydrophilic, which means they stay in the water side. So if you're making salad dressing, some things can dissolve into the olive oil, and some things can dissolve into the vinegar or the water or whatever. And when you choose one versus the other, you can avoid shutting down cholesterol production or minimizing it in your brain. So both of them are going to operate on the liver, but only one is going to make it through to the brain and maybe cause problems. So I thought that was a key point, and not everyone's familiar with the blood-brain barrier. I just wanted to kind of throw that in the mix as well.
Yeah, I'm gonna play devil's advocate against myself actually, and throw another wrench in there, and that is we're assuming an intact, healthy blood-brain barrier, which a lot of people don't have, because inflammation, those bacterial fragments, the LPS, Dr. John, Jimmy and I were talking about earlier, that kind of activity will damage the blood-brain barrier, and even some hydrophilic or non-lipophilic statins, they can then cross into the brain, or they generally can, but from having an intact blood-brain barrier is very protective against cognitive decline. But I think that most middle-aged and older Americans have harmed blood-brain barriers, quite honestly. Would you agree, Dr. John?
I haven't really looked into those studies, but what I find is when you have excessive inflammation, it ages you. It leads to more pain, more tissue damage. And it's the same thing with excessive glucose. Like you said earlier, glucose reacts with proteins, and the products are advanced glycation end products, and they gave it that name because it spells out AGES, and excess glucose in your blood, it ages the blood vessels in your eyes, it ages your heart, it ages your arteries, it ages all your organs. And so that I see on longevity says you need to have good glucose control. And when you can maintain insulin sensitivity, you don't end up having cells that are resistant to insulin, and you don't have excess glucose building up in your bloodstream. So so often if we could just fix that early point before all the downstream damage happens, like you throw the rock in the pond, and then it's all those ripples that ripple out from there that cause people so many other problems, where if we could just fix that up front, fix that insulin resistance. And I think what people don't realize about diabetes is it increases dramatically your risk of heart disease. It increases your risk of Alzheimer's. It increases your risk of so many different things. And I think they think, I'll just take more insulin. And that only is forcing the glucose into the cells. It's not fixing the root problem. I'm Dr. John. I'm going to hand back the mic.
I want to make one more comment about cholesterol and what good it does in the body. I think sometimes we forget it is anti-inflammatory. So wherever there's inflammation in the body, cholesterol shows up like a firefighter. So this is the analogy I usually give. Imagine your neighbor's house is on fire. That's the inflammation. And then the firefighter comes to put out the fire. And so when it comes to heart disease and atherosclerosis, people, they cut open those arteries. Oh my God, look at all that cholesterol in there. It must have been all that fat and cholesterol you ate in your diet that did that. No, it's the endogenous form of cholesterol that is trying to put out the inflammation caused by the penetration of the small, dense LDL particles we were talking about earlier, getting behind the arterial wall and causing that inflammation. The firefighters, the cholesterol, was just there to try to save you from the inflammation that you cause from the carbs, the sugar that Dr. Nick was talking about earlier, along with the oxidation of the omega-6 rich vegetable oils we were talking about. It's a recipe for disaster. We're blaming the firefighters for the fire, and they were never the culprit.
It's like banning ambulances to try to prevent fatal accidents. It's not the case. The ambulance didn't cause the accident. It shows up after the fact.
Right.
Yeah, I generally agree. I'm a little bit wary about becoming too say evangelical about like it's the best thing ever, because I see that a lot in the Twitter sphere, like, oh, your LDL is like 800, don't worry. And we don't necessarily know that's the case. So I want to just draw lines with literature does have its limits at this point, and also point out that, again, it's patient specific. So given if we were to assume that LDL was just completely anti-inflammatory, and I'm not sure that's an entirely accurate statement. We can go back and forth about this if you guys have other thoughts. I think it's definitely reactive to inflammation. Whether or not it itself is anti-inflammatory is another issue. But again, it can be corrupted. I want to circle back to that. So it's not protective in a situation where you have inflammation, because then it does become harmful. So can LDL contribute to heart disease? Absolutely. But it's not sufficient. And if there's one thing I think people, like, I would want to leave people with from this particular clubhouse, is that, in the general population, America at large, which is eating 60% of its calories from ultra-processed foods, high LDL, like lowering LDL, would actually be a good thing and save lives. So that's why you get these broad population studies where, look, statins like, lower risk. But in metabolically healthy people, which will happen when you're on a ketogenic diet if you're doing it properly and don't have specific genetic contraindications, then it's not an issue. So
right.
The metabolic circumstance really matters.
Well,
and I know you're on board with that. I just wanted to circle back to that.
And everything that I said was under the auspice of you're eating a well-formulated ketogenic diet. Thus, the room is called Keto Cholesterol Q&A. I'm assuming people are eating keto, but thank you for the distinction that it's a totally different circumstance if you're eating a standard American diet than if you're in a more well-formulated ketogenic diet. Triglycerides lower, HDL higher, CRP generally lower. It is a different beast altogether.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah, and I agree with what you said, and I don't. When I hear from someone and they say, "Okay, my LDL is at 325, 350, 400," and I don't necessarily see that as a good thing. But I do believe there are positive roles of cholesterol in the body. So I was more trying to say, here's the side you don't hear about. I don't take an extreme view here. I don't want to see my LDL go through the roof. And in fact, I actually changed my diet and took out some of the saturated fat and replaced it with monounsaturated, primarily olive oil, because my LDL was going up a lot. I'm one of those high. And meaning if I eat a lot of saturated fat, my body makes a lot of cholesterol. And I just was kind of covering my bases there, meaning covering my bets and so on. So I don't want to suggest that higher is better or that higher can't cause problems, because I think it can. And I think even the large fluffy, some people that have familial hypercholesterolemia, I can never say that, that have FH, I should have just said FH. Sometimes they make the big fluffy beach ball particles, but yet they still can, they can still have problems. So it's not that it's like, I think of it like water. And water is a critical thing for life, but if you have a pipe that breaks and water's pouring out, or if you have a leaky pipe in your basement and that water drips into the drywall and in that form creates mold toxin, it can ruin your life. Approach is, let's dig up the front yard and put in and cut down the water flow through. And guess what? Yes, dripping into the drywall, but then when you go, you say, gee, it takes all day to fill up the bathtub. The water pressure sucks in my shower. My glasses aren't getting clean in the dishwasher. Those are the side effects, because it has its good side as well. But clearly, oxidized cholesterol in that first layer in your blood vessel can trigger your immune cells to go in and go after it. And, when you have that inflammation and that going on, that can start to thicken, and you can start to affect blood supply. So I don't want to picture it like it's a magic cure. At the same time, I don't think people ever hear about what's good about it. So I was just trying to kind of go, give them the other view as well.
Yep.
Jimmy, I want to open it up to you as well. Yeah.
Yep. Go ahead, Nick.
I was just going to say I 100% agree, and I'm glad we got onto that. The only reason I brought up the topic was, assuming that we are in a keto clubhouse and people aren't doing damage to their endothelial walls and having that inflammation, then we won't be having that process of the LDL invading the wall, the fireman or the ambulance. So
Right.
that only occurs in a system of poor metabolic health, let's just say broadly. But in that circumstance, I'm not entirely sure. And I've heard that analogy. I've heard people I really respect use it. It was in Fat Fiction, and I love that documentary. But I don't know. I guess my caution comes from, I think the literature for LDL being the cause of heart disease is so phenomenally weak, and the literature for low carb diets potentially being very good for overall metabolic and cardiovascular health is so phenomenally strong. I get very sensitive, this is a me thing, about the verbal precision around the way we talk about these things, just because right now, unfortunately, this is still such a unconventional, let's say, view. And so I've been in these situations where I make little errors. We've been talking now for almost an hour and 20 minutes. It has been great, and I think we've shared a lot of interesting content and shared great content. But I've produced content or shared content with conventional thinkers, and it can be like a 2-hour podcast. It's phenomenal. And if there's one little tidbit that's slightly inaccurate, like a vulnerability, they'll just use it to discredit the entire thing. And I've just seen that happen so many times that anytime I just get very uptight, so to speak, about verbal precision. And I just think that's everything. Nobody's going to be perfect, and I'm definitely not perfect all the time. But I do like to bring up that topic.
Well, and
I guess that was the background to which that informed my comment.
Well, and keep in mind that you try to translate this to a lay public. I'm a lay person. I asked a lot of the lipidologists and the researchers and the doctors, all right, all that gobbledygook you just said is all interesting. Now tell me what it really means. And I think sometimes in the translationalness of trying to make this into everyday language, you do lose some of the nuance. So I can appreciate your concern there, Dr. Nick, but I don't think it means we throw the baby out with the bathwater. If you get people just enough of a taste of what the truth is, it wants them to dig deeper. As it stands in the culture, people still greatly fear their cholesterol. Like somebody mentioned earlier, I was like, why are you worried about your high cholesterol? And they didn't know. They just knew that they needed to be. So I think having these kinds of conversations, even if something is a little more simplistic than it actually is, gets them at least engaged and interested in it, which has kind of been the crux of my work for a long time.
And Nick, I was going to say, I absolutely agree. I think it's great that you want to have all of us be as precise as possible. I think you're right that if you make 30 good points, but you overstate 1 or 2, then they will say, oh, that's what I'm going to go after. And I can't refute the 30 good points, but I can show that what you said here and here, there's a study that contradicts that. So being precise, I think that's right on the money. We just brought Dan up, and I don't know, Dan, if you have a question or a comment, but I was going to turn the microphone over to you if you're ready to ask a question or make a point.
I sure am. I don't have a point to make. I just have a question to ask. And I'm not even sure if this is something you guys can deal with. But being an endurance athlete, somebody that spends a lot of time running ultra marathons, I had some success using a keto diet to get fat adapted. I run, and Dr. John, by the look of your profile picture, you might have heard of Dr. Philip Maffetone. So I'm a big proponent of the 180 method. And I guess my question is that I do really well on this keto diet during training. So I was up to maybe 3+ hours of mountain running. I was living in Tahoe at the time with just water, not really using fuel, and I felt like I could really get that going. But during races, I feel like I really do need the carbs. Pre-race, during the race, and post-race to help me recover. In your opinion, do you think that is a good plan, that I can train carb-free? use them strategically around races to help me perform better and recover better, and then go back to the keto, because I felt like I could switch back and forth pretty easily when I was doing it. And I'm done speaking.
Maybe I'll talk for a second, and then we can bring in Jimmy and Dr. Nick. To me, it makes sense, and I think it sounds like you have good metabolic flexibility, meaning you can burn ketones, you can burn glucose. What happens is when you're really pushing it, the ketones are going to be burned in your mitochondria. But when you're really pushing it, and when you're asking your body to do more, especially if it's a sprint or something, then you can't get enough oxygen there to do oxidative phosphorylation in your mitochondria, meaning to make ATP through your mitochondria. So you then take glucose and you do some different chemistry on it, and you're only going to release 2 ATP per glucose molecule instead of getting, let's say, 36 or more if you did it through the mitochondria. But it's extremely fast. So when you're in a race, and I don't know, and if you're trying to kick for that last mile or whatever, that's when I think it's going to be hard for the oxygen to keep up. And I want to hear Dr. Nick's take on this. And I believe you're going to go anaerobic, and you're going to start, you're going to tap into that alternate fuel supply, which is inefficient, but can produce ATP at a very high rate. Of course, as you do that, the lactic acid is going to start to build up in your cells, and eventually the pH change is going to make you stop because it's going to become too painful. But Nick, why don't I turn it over to you, and I'd love to hear your take on it as well.
Yeah. So imagine first of all, my short answer is yes, Dan, that is a very good way to approach training and racing. That's probably going to generate your best results. Train like keto or fasted, and then race with carbs. And here's why. If you imagine like a bar that is split up into components, the bar representing how much energy you can generate, part of the bar is going to be composed of energy from fat and then energy from carbs. Now your energy from carbs, if you're pretty metabolically flexible, is going to be pretty consistent, but your energy from fat can change. So if you become fat adapted, you can supply more energy from fat, and that's been shown in trials. So Jeff Volek's FASTER trial showed that I think it was an average improvement of 230% maximal fat oxidation, maximal fat burning. So once people got fat adapted, they could burn 230% more energy from fat. They can burn fat at 2.3-fold faster rate. So then what happens is when you're racing, either a larger proportion of that bar can be composed of fat, which means there's less pull on glucose, so you need fewer carbs, or you could just have a bigger bar overall because the fat component increases, and then you tack on glucose, carbs, and you have a second fuel. So that's how it works, and I think a lot of people do that, where they train fasted, they train keto, and then they add on carbs for performance, because like Dr. John said, carbs will generate the quick fuel. And then you also mentioned recovery. Yes, carbs can help in recovery because they spike insulin, and insulin is a growth factor, so that it can help your muscles recover. It can also, the glucose and the insulin, help you replenish the muscle glycogen that you would have expired. So that's my response.
And Kendrick came up at the same time. Did you have a comment on this one?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a little bit. I'm an endurance athlete myself. I'm a cyclist, and I was following the ketogenic diet for quite a while, and found that I performed really well, except when I was doing more of that high intensity. At my top end was just missing a little bit that was just enough to make me get dropped or not make it over the top of that climb or not be able to compete in the sprint at the end of a race. And so I started introducing some more carbohydrate, especially during high intensity training and racing and all that. But I remained pretty much very low carb in between. So what I would consider looking into is maybe some periodization of your carbohydrates, where you could be pretty much following ketogenic lifestyle all the time, even when you're training at low to moderate intensity. But if you are training at higher intensities, and definitely when you're racing at higher intensities, that's when you're going to need those simple sugars to be there. One thing I would caution is there is some talk in the literature. I can't cite anything specifically off the top of my head, but there is talk about being full-on fat adapted, where you start to lose some of your ability of glycolysis. And so when you need to go burn that carb at that high intensity moment, you downregulated all those pathways as a keto adapted person, and you might not be able to tap into that the way that you used to, or the way that somebody who is used to eating carbohydrates can. Last thing I'll add is, if you are an endurance athlete, I would highly recommend checking out Fast Talk Laboratories. They have an amazing podcast that's been going on for several years, and what they do is they just talk about the data, and they break down studies, and they debunk myths, and they talk about that there's several episodes on keto versus not keto and all the science behind it, and I think you would find that super helpful.
Dan, did we answer your question?
Yeah, for the most part, you have. I think that's great, good stuff. I mean, I don't really need it for like a kick, like Dr. John was thinking. I mean, like, you know, my events are typically 5+ hours. I mean, if I'm running 100 miles, then it could be anywhere between 24 and 30 hours, depending on how difficult the course is. So,
Dan, I want you to look up a guy named Zach Bitter. He's the ultra.
I know Zach.
Okay. Yeah, Zach Bitter, you guys, is an ultra marathon world record holder, and he has a whole protocol for how you can strategically add the carbs on race day and fill up the glycogen stores and then run on the fat for fuel. He's a great resource. I'm glad you know him.
Okay, thank you, Jimmy. I appreciate it.
I thought that Kendrick made some really good points, and I'm wondering, and I don't know if you have to see if other people have done this, but I'm wondering if, let's say 6 days a week, you're running more keto and you're training, and then 1 day a week you actually do introduce, I wouldn't go with sugars as much as slower release carbohydrate or whatever, because I do know if you go ketogenic long enough, your brain's always going to run a portion of its energy, derive a portion of its energy from glucose.
Yes.
And so if you're not bringing in enough carbohydrate to do that, then your body's going to turn protein into glucose, through gluconeogenesis. And sometimes the body will actually make itself a little insulin resistant, meaning your muscles, because it's trying to prevent them from taking up the glucose because it wants to save it for the brain. So I'm wondering if even if you're most of the time training in keto, if you did some training, if you alternated, 1 day or 2 days a week where you're running on carbs as well, maybe that would give you a higher plateau. Kind of getting back to what Kendrick said about, down-regulating your ability to do glycolysis, meaning to generate ATP without oxygen. So I just wanted to share that. And Kendrick, I thought that was a great point.
I want to add two things to that. One, I used to be an endurance athlete, used to do marathons, not anything longer, but I find in general with people with any degree of higher intensity activity, backloading carbs, as in carbs after the event, can be useful. It's when your muscles are most receptive to taking up the glucose, so it's less likely to go to your liver. The contractions of the muscles actually transport or help move the glucose transporters to the muscle surface. So right after your workout, your muscles are a little bit more receptive to carbs, and I even think 30, 40 grams is perfectly sufficient. And another thing I just want to add, a tiny nuance is, Jeff and John, you said your body becomes insulin resistant when you're keto adapted. I used to say that all the time as well. And I don't know if you've heard what Ben Bickman says about that. He's like my insulin resistance guru. I know you guys know Ben Bickman, but he says, when you're low carb, your body can become glucose intolerant, but that is not insulin resistance. Insulin resistance requires hyperinsulinemia. And so what happens on a ketogenic diet is you have low insulin. So you become glucose intolerant. If you were to do a glucose tolerance test, you would be intolerant to it and perform as if you were insulin resistant. But it's not because you're insulin resistant, it's because you're not producing as much insulin. So they go regression of some of the beta cells.
It's
And Nick, I agree with you, and I probably wasn't very precise in my language. Yeah, but I think you'll sometimes see people end up with higher fasting glucose, even though they're not eating any carbohydrate, because the muscles are not taking up the glucose and such. So I think, I probably didn't speak precisely enough there. So thank you.
And it's the same thing that happens when people have elevations in glucose in the morning. It's called physiologic insulin resistance. But what it actually is a glucose sparing effect for all the glucose dependent functions in the body. So yeah, sometimes people misinterpret these markers thinking they mean something else like insulin resistance. So thanks for that distinction, you guys.
And you're also always going to need some glucose available for your red blood cells, because
Yes.
they have no mitochondria and they can only make energy through the glycolysis pathway. So just another, the brain, people know the brain, but they don't realize the red blood cells also require some level of glucose as well.
Right.
But your body can make all it needs, and you're not necessarily going to break down muscle tissue because you're eating protein. If you only eat fat in your diet, you have to break down muscle. But ketones are muscle sparing. They protect muscle, plus you're eating protein. So even if you're eating zero carbs, it does not mean you're breaking down your muscle.
Yep. Well, guys, we've been going for over an hour and a half. I think we have exhausted this episode of Keto Cholesterol Q&A. We do this every Friday, 3 p.m. Eastern Time. So go join the Keto Clarity Clubhouse. Hit the little greenhouse at the top. Subscribe. We'd love to have you. Dr. John, Dr. Nick, Kendrick, thank you all for your contributions here today. Thank you all for being here. And just a reminder, this was recorded over on the Jimmy on Clubhouse Instagram page. If you missed any part, if you want to kind of recap it, look at it again, go watch the IGTV there. It'll also be up over on YouTube. Just do a keyword Jimmy on Clubhouse. You will find the episodes. But thanks so much for being here today, you guys, and we'll see you around the clubhouse.